Alright, so let's get started in Unit 5, the last one that you need to finish your curriculum unit. There's one more unit after this one, probably my favorite to be perfectly honest with you. But here is the one on lesson planning. I'm going to tell you there are going to be parts I'm going to kind of jump over pretty quickly, not because they're not important, but because there's so much stuff in these two chapters that I don't want to talk for 45 minutes or an hour and just have you falling asleep at your keyboard. So let's get into it. The first part we talk about is planning for learning, and which really is what lesson planning is, obviously. But there are two areas to look at, and what the authors did a great study where they took people of all kinds of educational backgrounds and asked them what makes learning engaging and what makes learning effective. And there were some very strong similarities between the two. I just want to very quickly read. This is on pages 195 and 196. The whole section is good, but the group that was asked about when are students most engaged, they said that when learning is hands-on, when it involves mysteries or problems, when it provided variety, opportunity to adapt, modify, or personalize the challenge, balance cooperation and competition between self and others, built upon real-world or meaningful challenges, uses provocative interactive approaches like case studies, mock trials, other kinds of simulated challenges, and involves real audiences or other forms of authentic accountability for the results. So the other group then, when they compiled their results, they were asked again, what makes student learning most effective? And they said that when work is focused on clear and worthy goals, when students understand the purpose of and the rationale for the work that they're doing, when models and exemplars are provided, when there is clear criteria that allow the students to accurately monitor their progress, when there's limited fear and maximal incentive to try hard, take risks, and learn from mistakes, when the ideas are made concrete made real through activities linking students' experiences to the world beyond the classroom, and when there are many opportunities to self-assess and self-adjust based on the feedback. So what you see there is you see some real strong similarities in that you can make learning engaging and effective by making it real and by guiding them through the process. Not telling them what to do, but guiding them through, giving them examples, and really kind of making this as real world as possible. So that's the first part there that kind of sets up the next two chapters. And they talk about the where-to elements in instructional planning, and this is pretty much the crux of Chapter 9. It really kind of goes through. So rather than talk through each one, I'm just going to very briefly first tell you that where-to stands for the W is where and why in a lesson plan. H is the hook and being able to hold their attention. E is to equip them with necessary experiences. R is to give them a chance to rethink, reflect, and revise. E is to give them a chance to evaluate where they're at. T is to tailor that learning for the individual students. And O is to be organized and really kind of set up the unit to provide deep understanding for your students. So let's kind of talk about each one a little bit more in depth. Not a lot though. I am going to go pretty quickly through here. So the first part is the where and why. And you can see the page numbers on each part as we go through. The students have to know where they're going. Students are not going to sit there and just listen to you as the expert anymore. Perhaps when we were younger and we were going through school, we just said, well, the teacher obviously knows what they're talking about. Students today just don't have that mentality anymore. So you have to set up, and students have to know where they're going. I always told my students, and sometimes I regretted this, but I would tell them, if there's ever a question as to why we're doing something, ask, why are we doing this? And what you need to do is before you do anything, ask, why are we doing this? And as long as you do that, it's going to make a lot more sense to the students, and they'll have that roadmap in their head of where you're heading. But it doesn't also hurt to specifically say that. Tell them where you're going and why. Make sure your work is purposeful. This sounds like common sense, but really you'll be surprised at how often we don't have purposeful work. I'll give you examples in one word. Homework. All too often we're given homework for no reason, really. I mean, and you might say, well, no, there's always a reason for doing the homework. It gives them extra practice. Yes, but if they're practicing it incorrectly, it's bad practice. So if you're basically letting homework go more than one day without grading it and giving feedback to those students, and they're not seeing those results with a very fast turnaround, it's not purposeful. It's busy work. And if they're practicing it wrong, they are getting further and further off the track by doing that practice rather than keeping up with everybody else. So make sure your work is purposeful. I'm not saying eliminate homework. I am not an anti-homework person. I never have been. But to not grade it, not give feedback, not use it as an assessment tool is a waste of your time whenever you do get around to grading it, and the students' time, because they're not getting feedback on the work they're doing. Then, a big one here, and this was something I really had a hard time with, was planning for adjustment. You need to be aware that sometimes your class is different from year to year. There were years when I had classes that loved to read. Boy, we used to really get into some great in-depth discussions. I had other years when I had kids that were, the majority of my class was 2 or 3 years off grade level as far as reading goes. It was a really rough year, so what I had to do is I really had to adjust my lessons, my units, to try to capture what they really wanted to get out of it, and to kind of build them in there. Because if you've got a group that you design a unit for a group that really loves reading, you try to do that same unit with a group that doesn't love to read, they are disengaged right off the bat, and you have lost them for the entire unit. So be ready to build in planned adjustment time, not only for the entire unit direction, but sometimes individual lessons. And again, for some of us that sounds like common sense. It wasn't for me. I had my plan, and this is the way it went. So a lot more information on there. Let's talk about the next section, the hook and hold. Have you ever had a colleague say, or have you ever felt like you're getting halfway through a lesson and you go, I lost them. I don't know where it happened, I don't know when it happened, but they're gone. They're daydreaming, they're throwing paper, they're acting up, and those days when you want to just, ram your head against the wall. Yes, sometimes it's the students, but a lot of times they're not engaged in the work. If they're not engaged in the work, that's the first thing they're going to do, is act up. So the point is, if you don't have a hook, you'll never even have an opportunity to lose them. You have to grab their attention right off the bat. You have to make it engaging. So there are some great examples of hooks or anticipatory sets if you want to go back to Madeline Hunter. There are some great ones in the book. I highly recommend you look at them, just read through them. Maybe it'll help generate some ideas for you. But without a hook for your entire unit, and then smaller hooks for your individual lessons, you're going to lose them before you ever grab them. But the big thing is, the key to this is you can have great, wonderful hooks, but if they have nothing to do with your unit, you guys are just messing around. Not that I'm not one to have fun, but you have to be able to move from the entertaining piece to the essential questions and to the essential parts of your unit to build toward understanding. If they can't see how that mystery or that hook or that anticipatory set moves through the unit and how it relates to everything that you're doing, you're wasting time. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're developing these hooks. Very important piece, I'm not going to lie. The next part, we're talking about exploring and experiencing things, enabling, equip them. There's a lot of ease there. But basically, this is the part that we really do usually focus in on. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But one thing that I know that I definitely didn't do is I kind of took for granted that I need to give them what I know, and that I have the knowledge, I have the understanding, I got to give it to them. Very rarely did I say, how can I take the knowledge and understanding that I have and modify it to relate to something they already know or do or use. For example, students that really like to skateboard, well, that's a math equation right there. Distance equals rate times time. So you start thinking about their interests, their activities, or their experiences that they've already had, and how you can build upon that and put your content in those contexts. So think about their experiences. Give students the ability to explore and enable them to want to learn more and to build toward understanding, because I can stand up there and I can I can talk about this stuff for months. I could have nothing but videos for this course and discussion boards. You guys would not get anything out of it unless you did it. So I'm hoping to enable you by telling you the basics and then having you apply that in a real contextual situation. So I hope I'm providing a good experience here and a good example for you, but I might not be. But I'm hoping I am. So try to basically have them apply knowledge, let them explore. Now that is not saying that you should never lecture. Obviously I am. So the point is, there are times to lecture, but that shouldn't be your go-to all the time. And then on page 211 they talk about adding up the facts. I thought this was a really cool idea. There's a nice little graphic there, and basically it takes they take the subparts, some of the smaller pieces of a lesson or a unit, and they put them on kind of lay them out as a math problem, and the students have to take those mini facts, add it up to get the big idea, or perhaps the essential question, or the understanding. And those are just some ideas that I've seen that I thought that was excellent. So let's go into the R. Reflect, rethink, and revise. You really have to give students time to have that self-assessment reflection. Again, this was something I left out. I was more about, when I started teaching, it was give them the knowledge, make them use the knowledge, give them more knowledge the next day, make them use it, and we just that was the cycle that we went through. There needs to be time for self-assessment, and then to reflect on that. Hopefully that you're able to do that. If you watch a video, you kind of sit back in your chair and look up at the ceiling and say, gosh, I never thought of it like that. I'm hoping you've had at least one of those moments so far in this course. If not, I guess I'm not doing my job well enough. But that is something that you should give students time to do. We used to have about 3 minutes. That's all it was, because honestly at 10 years old they didn't need any more time than that. But we would get done with, we'd have 3 minutes right before lunch, and I'd say, I want you guys to sit back and think about what you've learned today, how it's different than what it was before. And they would just sit and think about it. They didn't have to say a word, they didn't have to write down anything, and they loved it because they didn't have to do anything. All they were doing was sitting there and was thinking about it. And what they didn't understand is that had just as much impact as me making them write it down. Okay, anyway. After that, allow them to verbalize or write down their revisions in their head. Have them revise what they thought. And this was just a sentence stem that I found helpful. I used to think this, but now I think this. And it really kind of forced them. And what sometimes all we did was we just verbalized. I just say, okay, anybody that raised their hand, I would say, go ahead, tell me. Well, I used to think that multiplication was something I had to memorize, but now I realize it's just adding up 5 5s instead of having to memorize it. I know what it means now. Something along those lines. And granted, my 10-year-olds never. If they would have said something like that, I probably would have cried with happiness. But that's the idea. So the next thing is evaluating work in progress, and this is where we really start talking about the need for formative assessment, which I'm going to get to a little bit later with Chapter 10. But evaluate the work and the progress that they're making. Know where your students are. They should know where they're at. They should understand that they're falling behind. Now, students usually have a pretty good grasp on whether or not they're quote-unquote getting it. The problem lies in us. Sometimes we think they're getting it, but they're not. Or we think that this student is just not trying when they really are, and they just have one little gap that needs to be filled in, and they'll be right there with us. So it is very important that we build in that formative assessment and that self-assessment again as well. It kind of overlaps with the one before. There on pages 216 and 217, there really are some good tips on how you can build in those types of things. Then the next part, tailoring and personalizing the work. If you haven't heard differentiated instruction yet, I don't know where you're teaching, but you've had to have heard it by now. Whenever this movement first started, I guess, goodness, it's probably been close to a decade ago, you would hear audible groans every time anybody said differentiated instruction. And that's because in its early stages, it was basically translated in our heads to it means that we have to have an individual plan for each person, and I have to design the same unit 20 different ways for 20 different kids and 20 different ways to learn. That could not be further from the truth. If that's your understanding of differentiated instruction, I really highly recommend you take a mini workshop or something that does a one-day kind of deal where they just do nothing but talk about how you can use differentiated instruction in your classroom, because it is very powerful. But the basic meaning is that you don't need to recreate everything for everybody, and just try to think of simple modifications that really can target those major gaps that students continue to have. If you have a student who can't read very well and you're aware of that, then maybe you provide modifications for you might read them the things during lunchtime, or things like that. Now, when I say modifications, usually people usually associate that with special education. I will tell you that many times special education teachers or the resource teachers usually already have their modifications pretty well set out for them. All you have to do is ask them. When I say modifications for this class, I'm trying to think of you planning ahead and try to think of ways that you might be able to modify if certain students have issues that are not necessarily special education students. So be thinking greater than just that. So let's talk about the last one, the O, organizing for optimal effectiveness. This, again, to me, when I was reading this, sounded like common sense the first time, but I really put some thought into it and realized I wasn't always doing it. So you really need to scope out your big ideas, your understandings, your essential questions right off the bat, and start thinking about, okay, so I've got all this stuff. I know how I'm going to assess it. I know what it's going to look like when we're done. Now, what makes the most sense? So I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to get into textbook in a minute, but the way the textbook does it doesn't always mean that's the way you need to teach it. So please, don't get stuck on that. But think about, okay, try to minimize those possible misconceptions. Sometimes we lay things out in a sequential order. We don't really necessarily need to do that. Sometimes rearranging a few things might make those misconceptions go away a little bit. And what we really want to do is maximize engagement. So everything else equal, if you've got some areas that are usually quote-unquote more fun than other areas, then do one of those first, sprinkle that in the middle, and then do it at the end as well. Try to balance those areas that are quote-unquote fun with those areas that usually aren't as engaging. And then maybe you could try to come up with ideas throughout to kind of build that up and really kind of continue that engagement train. So engagement is very contagious. Once it starts catching, it's hard to get rid of it. So try to spread that out as much as possible. So then we get into teaching for understanding, and this kind of goes a lot deeper than just the actual lesson planning. It's the whole process that's going on in your head as you're writing those plans. The first thing they talk about is coverage versus uncoverage, and to put that in its simplest terms, coverage is what we do all the time. It's the old phrase, we're going a mile wide and an inch deep. And what we really want to do is we want to do the uncoverage, an inch wide and a mile deep. But we don't have much say-so in how wide we go. We can't go an inch wide. We have to go that mile wide still, because we're told we have to teach all this. So the key to doing that is to try to package things together and look at the bigger ideas, much bigger than those individual skill levels, which most objectives, most content is based around, is those skills. Let's look bigger than the skills, and let's uncover them and unpackage them together. And when you do that, you will see that multiple things can be going at the same time. So the textbook. I'll give you a quick story. I had a teacher walk up to me. She was a wonderful teacher, one of the best communication arts teachers I'd ever worked with in my life. Had to teach math the next year. Was very, very nervous about doing so. She walks up to me with the textbook, the math textbook, and she opens it up. She says, "Okay, so I'm having trouble with this. Can you tell me which sections which lessons in here, what pages you actually teach, and what pages you don't teach throughout the year?" And I looked at her. I said, "I have no idea." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "My kids rarely bring their math book with them." She goes, "What? How are they able to do math without the math book?" It was like this brand new concept to her, and I said, well, the examples in there are usually pretty terrible. I usually provide them with things, and there's occasionally times when we bring it, but to me it's a resource. We use it when we need something, but a lot of times we don't. So think of the textbook as a resource. Think of it as a dictionary. You grab it, you use it when you need to use it, but most of the time you're really not going to use it heavily. Now, that being said, I know that we do rely on the textbook a lot in this course. I'm pulling a lot of the same information out, but you'll notice I don't go in the same order that the textbook did either. It didn't make the most sense to me, so that's the way I chose to do it. So you also need to design the right experiences. And what I'm saying by saying that, I'm saying that you need to make sure that it works for your group. Again, individualize your class, look at your class, make sure it's the right experience for them, because what is a great learning experience for some classes is not going to be the same experience for another one. And then uncoverage. When we start doing readings and we start looking at text and we start looking at things like that, some really good textbooks ask really good questions. This textbook, for example, asks a lot of great questions. It makes you think about what you're actually doing and not doing. Some just give you the facts. If you have a text in any subject, it could be math, social studies, science, communication arts, fine arts, doesn't matter. If it gives the facts and it doesn't ask a whole lot of questions that really probe you to think about what you're doing and what you're thinking about as a student and what your students are reading, then you need to make up the questions. Read ahead. Make your students start asking the questions. Have your students start saying, what does that mean? What does that talk about? Encourage your students to question the text, because if they're just reading the text and taking it verbatim in, they're not getting that full understanding. They're just taking the words at face value and not really applying it. So really pull that information out, work with it, massage it, make that learning work, make that text work for you. So then we start talking about your approach. And again, this goes into the big approach of, oh, well, this book obviously doesn't want me to lecture, Dr. Potter doesn't want me to lecture. And I will tell you, again, nothing could be further from the truth. But you need to be purposeful in thinking about it. You don't just lecture just because, well, we're going to start with the lecture, and then we're going to move into this, and then we're going to move into that. Page 241, I mean, there's a lot of pages in there that talk about your using your purpose. Actually starts on page 240, but the table on page 241 I think is excellent, because it really talks about the ways that you can learn, can teach, and the way that you can run your classroom. And it also talks about what students will be doing in that process. So sometimes it is passive, other times it is very active, but it depends on where you want them to go and what you're trying to accomplish in your approach. So again, something that may sound commonsensical to you, but it really isn't, because we tend to fall back on what we're most comfortable with. And my personal example, again, inquiry-based learning, I was very uncomfortable with, but I found that in the correct situations, inquiry learning was a million times more valuable than any lecture or activity that I could have planned. Again, and now we talk about timing being everything. Timing is key to this, so be thinking about when should you do this, when shouldn't you do it throughout your unit. Don't just, again, start every lesson the same way, middle of the lesson the same way, end of the lesson the same way. Kids love structure, they really do, and they love a schedule, but that being said, vary it up occasionally. Don't just do it the same way just because that's what they need. They need to have the best approach for the given situation. That's what they need. Finally, let's talk formative assessment. One of my pet peeves, as you've probably picked up on throughout these videos, is the formative assessment that we use is anything but formative assessment. We give homework assignments all the time. We give quizzes, pop quizzes, and we go over that and we kind of move on. Formative assessment is key to I think, the key that's holding us back in moving forward with No Child Left Behind or with the Common Core, or any of those things. I really, my personal belief, take it for what it's worth. You might think I'm insane. I'm okay with that. But formative assessment is where we really fall short a lot of times. We should be assessing students every single day, and we should have an idea every single day of where they're at, what they need, where they're falling short. At the very least, in the college level, every single week. So the reason I say that is formative assessment. First of all, a couple of quick points on the formative assessment. It doesn't need to be paper pencil. That's, again, when I say assessment, I don't mean test. Assessment can be doing an activity. For example, I saw a kindergarten class practice lining up, and the teacher just had a quick note card and was quickly writing down, first week of school, students that didn't know how to line up. Wasn't a test, they didn't get in trouble. It was just a quick and easy way for her to see if they understood the concept of lining up. So it can be an action, and high school students, they can do that too. It doesn't have to be paper and pencil. It doesn't have to be anything that's cumbersome. It can be something very quick. It can happen in 30 seconds. It can be something longer. Homework should be nothing but formative assessment. I stated this earlier, but homework should be nothing but formative assessment. And I'm going to tell you now, that's my personal opinion. If they can do it 5 times, they can do it 50 times. They don't need to do it 50 times. If they can do it 5 times correctly, they can do it 50 times correctly. They give some great techniques on checking for understanding. They've got index cards. They've got a 1-minute essay, which you give them just 1 minute to just write as quickly as they can. Question boxes. I love this idea of question boxes. An analogy prompt, concept maps, things like that. So a formative assessment can be a fun thing. It can be a fun activity that they look forward to doing. We used to have exit passes at lunch. Before they could leave for lunch, they had to tell me one question they still had from that morning. And it was a great way for me to look back and say, oh man, I probably need to hit that again if I saw the same thing repeated. But that's a formative assessment, because you really kind of get to the crux of, man, my students really don't get this. They don't know this. So that's a little bit more on teaching for understanding. Let's now talk about your lesson plans as you're going forward. Again, before I get into this, let me restate my little summary there, well, long-winded summary probably, is not a substitution for looking over chapters 9 and 10. Make sure that you do that, because you will not get everything out of chapters 9 and 10 by just listening to what I had to say. I'm guiding you. That's all I'm doing. I am not giving you everything you need. So, as you're writing your lesson plans, the first thing that you should hopefully notice is that it's not as difficult to come up with the ideas for your lesson plans as it usually is. That was the first thing that really hit me when I did my first Understanding by Design unit. I said, these lessons are it's still taking a lot of time to type it all out, but the ideas were there. It was so much nicer to be able to write everything out. And that's because you've planned everything out. It's like taking a trip. If I'm in St. Louis and I'm going to Fort Lauderdale, I'm not just going to get in the car and just start driving in a random direction and hope I end up in Fort Lauderdale, or think, man, I have no idea how long it's going to take me to get there. I know the general direction I need to go, but I have no idea how long it's going to take to get there. I'm just going to pedal to the metal and hope I get there pretty quickly. No, you sit down with a map and you say, okay, first day, I need to go, you know your end in mind, you know you're going to Fort Lauderdale, so you've already got that planned out. And now you start looking at each piece. Okay, so how do I need to break this down? Where am I going to go from day 1 to day 2 to even a day 3 in some cases? So, you kind of plan that out. And you've already done that. That's what your understanding and your essential questions are doing, and your assessment's telling you what it looks like, what they should be able to do at that finish line. So you've really got those milestones in your head without even realizing it. So your lesson plans are going to flow a little bit easier than they probably have in the past. That's a good thing. So now let's talk about what I'm asking for. Let's talk format. I do not have a preference on the format that you use. If you are currently working for a school district and they have a lesson plan format that you usually follow, great, use it. I'll adjust and look at and figure out what I need to figure out by looking at your format. That's fine. If you have your school district doesn't have a requirement, but you have a certain lesson plan that you're comfortable with, that's fine. Use it. If you have nothing and you have no clue on what you want the format to use because you realize that your lesson plans to this point have been a couple words in a lesson plan book and you're kind of embarrassed about that, then go to the lesson plan format that's in the textbook. It's part of Unit 1 and it is very general. Will help you kind of lay things out the way that you need to. It's a good lesson plan format. Let's talk Madeline Hunter. Madeline Hunter had some great ideas. Madeline Hunter had some wonderful ideas. She had hooks and anticipatory set in there. She had procedures. She had all those great steps in there. Do I need it to be as thorough as a Madeline Hunter? Absolutely not. Here's what I need. I need you to make sure that you are addressing all your understandings and essential questions throughout that unit. To make sure that you're doing so, it's not because it's easier for me, but it's because it's easier for you. Make sure that on each lesson, write out what understandings and essential questions are addressed within that lesson. Side note, lesson does not necessarily mean day. Certain lessons may take 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Okay, so don't get the word lesson equated with the word day in your head. But you need to make sure that your understandings and essential questions are addressed throughout that unit. Now you may have 3 or 4 different times when a certain understanding is being used throughout that unit. That's great. That's wonderful. I love that. So make sure that you do list them if they're being used, and they can be used multiple times. Make sure that you have your hook listed. What is your hook? How are you going to get the students in that day? You should have a very strong hook the first day of your unit. The rest of the time, you still need a hook. It doesn't necessarily need to be as engaging. It can build upon that first day hook, but you definitely have to have some sort of hook to really pull the students in. Make sure that that's included and easily identified in your lesson plans. Procedure. This is the part where you probably get to be happy, because I do not need to know every word you say in a lesson. I do not need to know every time the students turn around and talk to somebody. I do not need to know every step of every day, because we're talking 20, 30 pages for lesson plans. I don't need that great of detail. I just need a basic procedure where you're just telling me, I'm going to do this, the students are going to do this. I'm going to do this, the students are going to do this. That's all I need. I don't need it to be in great detail. I just need to have a general idea of what's going to be happening in your classroom. I need to know other important questions you're going to ask. Obviously, I'm hoping that your essential questions are going to be asked at some point throughout the unit. However, there are a lot of other important questions. The questioning has been linked to so much engagement. It is not even funny why this isn't stressed more, not only in this textbook, but throughout all of our education classes. I have no idea. So write down some important questions on top of those essential questions that you're going to ask. Now you can put them right up there with the essential questions. If you like that format better, linking all question things together, that's fine. And in fact, a lot of times your questions are simply going to be more clarification or breakdowns of your essential questions anyway. So where you put them, I don't care. But they do need to be in there somewhere. These are some important questions that I'm going to be asking throughout. Throughout your procedure, you might have those questions sprinkled in there at the point at which you're going to ask them. That's fine too. Whatever makes the most sense for you. But make sure that you are telling me throughout what are some important questions I'm going to make sure that I ask. Formative assessment needs to be addressed. You should be formatively assessing them every single lesson. Again, it might not be something that's written. It might be something that's very informal. So please make sure you review the area on formative assessment so that you get some ideas of ways that you can assess them without worrying about, oh boy, that's more I'm going to have to grade, And then look at modifications. Be thinking ahead. I should see some ways that you might be able to modify the content, the delivery, or the procedures in case it's not working. So start thinking ahead. How might this just completely cannonball? And you might say that's a very pessimistic attitude towards teaching. You might be right, but it's always better to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best. So kind of keep that in mind. So those are the things I have to see in your lesson plans. You can include much more than that if you want. If you want to go Madeline Hunter, fine, that's great. You can include anything you want to in your lesson plans. And in fact, I will tell you, if you are using a school district assigned lesson plan and they have more areas that are not included here, they have you fill in, for example, use of technology or something like that. Go ahead and fill it in now, because that way you can just take this unit and run with it and use it. Remember, you've got 3 weeks to do this. I'll give you a couple of quick disclaimers though. One, don't wait till the end. Yes, your lesson plans will be written easier, but it's still going to take time to type it all up. So make sure that you're thinking ahead. 2, make sure you're looking at the rubric. I know I've said that before, and I'm hoping you're in the practice of already looking at the rubrics, but it's very key that you look at the rubric so you know exactly how I'm going to assess you. And 3, make sure that you understand that you are going to have some mini assignments, nothing really detailed, but there's going to be some discussions and other things throughout the next 3 weeks. So please make sure that you're not just thinking, oh, well, last week I can really bust it out that last week. Start working on them now. Start scoping things out. And again, as always, ask questions. Put those questions in the question forum. Nothing makes me happier than to see people answering each other's questions or giving each other advice, or even me asking or me answering questions, because that means you're involved. That means you're thinking about your lessons. It's okay to have questions. It's great to have questions. So put them in there. Let's keep this going. If you need any other help, let me know. Good luck writing your lesson plans, and hopefully have fun.